You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. Joining John today is Dr. Brian Keating. Dr. Keating is a physics professor at the University of California, San Diego, and the director of the Simmons Observatory, specializing in the study of gravitational waves created during the early stages of the Big Bang. Dr. Keating is also a pilot and is the recipient of the 2007 Early Career Award for scientists and engineers for his work with BICEP.
Dr. Brian Keating, welcome back to the program.
It's always the highlight of my astronomical calendar when I get to go on a show with you, John.
Oh, I feel so sorry for you, man, if that's your bar of quality. Brian, you have written a new book, Into the Impossible, Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner. What drove you to sit down and begin typing away at the computer and kicking out this book?
I did it as a service to my former self with the hope that time travel would be invented someday. You may know this famous story where Stephen Hawking one day put out a table at Cambridge and it said, "Welcome, time travelers." And then the next day he put in an advertisement in the Cambridge newspaper calling for the for the event to be held the previous day. And so I am hoping that Hawking's version of time travel will work. And if I don't get the benefit, at least young graduate students, astronomy or non-STEM fields or not, young people, even some old people will benefit from the knowledge, not only the knowledge though, but the wisdom of these 9 Nobel laureates who shared hours and hours of their time with me and distilled that which can only be gleaned over time, which is, as I say, their wisdom. So I thought it would be kind of a shame if only the people that watch the YouTube videos or listen to the podcast had access to it. I want to give them resources, tools, tips, tricks, hacks to succeed in life, no matter what they do, based on these remarkable intellects that I've had the honor of interviewing.
Now, let's pick one. Let's pick Roger Penrose with conformal cyclic cosmology. Now, this is a revolutionary idea and also a very controversial idea. It says that we are not the first universe and that there may be others, and that this idea could possibly be proven by looking at the cosmic microwave background radiation, looking for the echoes of black holes. That's your wheelhouse. Have you ever seen anything that led you to believe that maybe there's something in the CMB that tells us there was a previous universe?
No, and in fact, I had the dishonor, I'm sure I was not honorable, but I spoke at the 90th birthday celebration for Sir Roger, which was held in August of 2021. So he's 3 billion seconds old, approximately. And I spoke and I said, I'm going to give you a very, very ignominious present, which is to say all the criticisms of the conformal cyclic cosmology. And I didn't think that was very honorable of me. So I did conclude with a salute to this theory, which is not accepted by very many people, I should say. That's not necessarily a reason not to accept it or pursue it. But there is one virtue of that cosmology that it alone has, which is technical in nature, having to do with not the proof of it, as you mentioned, John, but actually the possible potential to disprove it, as well as another feature that it has, which is to not have to invoke magical features, fields known as scalar fields, of which we only know the existence of one in the cosmos. So it has virtues, it has flaws. There were claims by Sir Roger and his collaborators that not only was this a possibility, but there are actually Hawking points, these circles in the sky and microwave signatures in the CMB. And then I brought up some disconfirming evidence. And I would say at some level, Sir Roger illustrates to me the best example that no matter how brilliant you are, there is a tendency to perhaps maybe fall in love or be overwhelmed by the beauty, by the aesthetics, by the simplicity, and maybe even the correct power of a new theory that you yourself create. And I've been guilty of this, not in theory, but in experiment. And so for that, I thank him, and I have respect, utmost respect, for his fertility of mind, that he comes up with ideas that not only address problems in the current understanding of cosmology, but comes up with new ways to solve those problems themselves. You know, it's one thing for me to criticize you or you criticize me, but if I say there's a flaw in your argument, but here's a whole other argument, now that exposes me to critique, and I think that takes a lot of courage. So yes, he was one of my favorite. They're all my favorites, but his in particular was quite delightful to participate in.
Now, would you characterize as a scientist, being a scientist is ultimately an exercise in destroying your own ego?
As the Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts, not the wisdom, not the knowledge, not the magic or otherworldly potential of experts. Science progresses because we doubt those who came before us. Feynman also famously said, I'd rather have questions that cannot be answered than answers that cannot be questioned. And yet today we want to hold up not only science as ineffable, as ultimate authority, but scientists themselves. And I think that's very dangerous to sort of have this scientism, this worship, not of just the material, but of the process of science, as if it's monolithic, monocultural, when in fact it can be quite adversarial, it can be quite prejudiced, it can be quite sclerotic. And there are many, many challenges to, first of all, scientists. As I point out many times, scientists are inherently human, despite the stereotypes to the contrary. And I hope I humanize the scientist in this book, the otherworldly intellects, as human beings that suffer from the same foibles that you and I do. But yet, I think there is sort of a worship of the scientific method as if that existed in a monoculture. And I think that's unwarranted. And I think it does science a disservice. Because then, John, when we have a discovery that, as in my case, it was disconfirmed and has to be retracted effectively, then the public is left at best with an understanding of the primal discovery, the primary discovery, and never understands how the sausage gets made. And I think ultimately it will hurt science if we don't portray it as a self-correcting mechanism to look for truth, but ultimately always to be slightly unsuccessful.
Now, in the book, you say, if your work is irritating people, it's probably worth doing. So that alone sort of quantizes that down. Now, my question for you now is, over the last 70 years, we have had a phenomenon in the sky, the UAP, or UFO phenomenon, and multiple scientists have looked into it, and they came up with strange conclusions in the past. You know, there was Donald Menzel from Harvard, who thought, well, this is probably all natural origin, but there may be a natural origin we're unaware of. You know, that was his conclusion. Then you had James S. McDonald conclude that the aliens were actually the least worst hypothesis. And then finally, you had, of course, J. Allen Hynek, who thought it was something that was completely different than anything we've ever seen. So you are now on the Galileo Project, a sort of scientific overseer to make sure that the methodology and everything is good. You think you're going to find anything?
Well, that's
will you, when you do find something, will you go completely public and open with it and just say, throw caution to the wind and annoy people with your work?
So here, I am an equal opportunity irritator, in that I do believe you should have a certain level of discomfort. Just like I can tell by looking at you, of course, that you are a physical specimen who is not a stranger to the gym. So you ever go to the gym? I never go to the gym. Let me speak for myself. I never go to the gym. I'm like, yeah, I can't wait. This is awesome. Like, it's irritating because growth is painful, right? And no one who's gone through real growth and had the courage to go through growth would think any otherwise. So now I have irritations for both sides, the pro-UFO, UAP, alien civilization camp, and the anti-skeptic denier crowd that is also trafficking in the same phenomenon. And that is the following. No one would be more pleased and more thrilled and excited and titillated by the discovery of an extraterrestrial civilization than a good scientist. He or she would be delighted, because what would it allow us to do? It would allow us to bypass the current constraints of the physical laws as we understand it, of technology, of travel, maybe teleportation, all these incredible, outlandish things that my theoretical friends publish in their books, about wormholes, et cetera. They would have actual access to it. And maybe they'd be able to control these things. Imagine being able to make a black hole, a wormhole, some other kind of hole, and be able to manipulate space and time. So scientists would bypass the limitations of our current generation. It'd be like, telling Galileo about the results of the Large Hadron Collider. He would be as thrilled as possibly could be at understanding the laws of unification theories that we understand. So that's on one side. On the other side, there is a notion of a vast scientific cover-up of perhaps a science industrial complex where scientists like me or my colleagues are covering up at the SETI Institute, covering up evidence for our own benefit. As they say, Upton Sinclair said, it's hard to convince a man of a fact when his very job and salary depends on him not believing in that fact. So I get equal amounts of comments on my videos with people like Seth Shostak or Michael Shermer, or perhaps with Jill Tarter even, that are negative and critical. And then I get criticisms of people like Tom DeLonge and Jim Semivan, who've been on my show, discussing the pro-UFO side of things, as if there is a conspiracy by big astronomy to cover up data. And I point out that there's a misconception that I'm hoping I will help clear up with in my oversight role, along with many other esteemed scientists, as you know, Seth Shostak, Alan Stern, Paul Davies, and many other people who are disconnected from the results. In other words, I'm not going to win the Nobel Prize or get rich and famous if this succeeds. The danger being, of course, that we don't look under every sort of nook and cranny for an alternate explanation. Whatever side you're on, you have to confront your biases, and your bias may be pro or anti, and I'm hopefully splitting the middle. Although, John, as you know, there's an old Yiddish proverb that he who stands in the middle of the road gets hit by traffic from both sides. So hopefully that won't happen to me. But I am as delighted, excited as possible about being involved, no matter what the result turns out to be.
So anyway, all right, Brian, what do you think the bias comes from? What do you think? Why is it polarized? This whole discussion about UAP is highly polarized, almost political in a way, and people react to it emotively. That's not healthy, and it's not going to tell us if there is or is not something to the phenomenon. Even if it's ball lightning, you still get people emotively reacting. That to me says that there's more to the issue than simply a scientific question, but a cultural question. Do you see that, and what do you think it is?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a notion that science is done by dispassionate, autonomous robots or something like that, unfeeling, uncaring. And partially, as I say, it's our own fault, because the old joke, how do you know a scientist is outgoing? Because he looks at your shoes when he talks to you. That's a kind of a canard that has some validity in practice. In other words, scientists have been given a script of reality that is literally magical by all definitions, Arthur C. Clarke's included. And yet we are some of the worst expositors and presenters of that information. And there's a clear reason why that occurs, because most scientists think it's beneath them to perhaps look and dissemination and look at ways that people in the media do stuff, because we have a natural disinclination and distrust of those types of people, of salespeople, of showboating, of sort of charlatans. And that is maybe in some ways deserved in some cases, who are professional expositors in a certain way. And that's how they make their living, by sensationalizing things. And I don't think that science needs sensationalization because it's, magic that's true, as it's said. And so we have this wonderful script, and yet we have these actors. That are performing a script far in excess of anything that Shakespeare could come up with. And yet we are not portraying it in its proper glory. And because of that, there is an inclination to associate, almost embarrassingly, as my friend and former guest Adam Frank said, aliens, when you hear the word aliens, you think of these characters with prosthetic foreheads. So there's this intermingling of the popular narrative from culture, fiction, nonfiction, that suggests less than serious approach should be warranted for aliens. And therefore, traditional scientists like me and others have been loath to expose ourselves to this field for fear of being, kind of lumped in as these either conspiracy theorists or as not really seriously taking this notion, and it's not something that a serious scientist should do. So I think on both sides, there is this distrust. And I see my role perhaps as being a communicator and expositor of both sides, because I fundamentally believe that debate is pointless. I've never been convinced by some presidential debate or some other debate that like, oh yeah, now I changed my mind. I'm not going to vote for this person or that person. No, it's rare that actually happens. On the other hand, there's a value in what I call, and the military uses as the steel man, straw man, or red team approach, where you'll have two teams will go at it with a positive goal in mind to elucidate truth, and they'll bring their best ammunition, but they'll also understand their debate opponent's perspective. And that's what I'm trying to inculcate in my involvement with the Galileo Project in particular.
Now, say that let's throw all of the biases and all of the stigma off for a moment and speculate. So, what if one of them actually ends up being a spacecraft of alien origin? That to me seems to be inherently dangerous, meaning that we suddenly have a global security problem because there's an alien civilization in our atmosphere with us. What, why is it here? And questions like that. And it seems to me that nothing good can come from that, right?
Well, I don't know. There's this notion that Hawking in particular espoused that, why would you invite the predator to dinner where you're the meal of choice? I think in some ways they're not, because we have this bias to see things through the human lens, through the lens of history that we've experienced or collectively as a species, that we tend to really kind of project onto possible new phenomena the existence of a motive that might not be actually correct. In other words, just as we can't, John, understand the technology for these creatures to get here, if indeed they're here, and believe me, there's reason to be skeptical about that as well. Just as we can't understand the physics, perhaps we can't understand their sociological urges as well. I mean, for every civilization that was wiped out by imperialistic colonizers, there's a parent of a dog. I see all these dog moms and dads, and we could obviously subdue the dog or even the cat, with enough effort and time and money. But nevertheless, we don't subjugate them. They serve some sort of purpose for us that they cannot understand. And I'm not, God forbid, comparing anything particular. But the point being that we can no more assess their motivation than we can assess the physics that would get them here, if indeed they're here.
So, Brian, if one ends up being of alien origin, and you only need one white crow, as they used to say, to know that white crows exist. If one exists, and that immediately makes our position in the universe as not being alone in a big way, we are not alone, and we're not alone on this planet. Does that necessarily mean if you are in contact, that level of contact with an alien civilization that's more advanced than you are, doesn't that mean that the solution to the Fermi paradox is necessarily the zoo hypothesis?
Yeah, I've thought about the zoo hypothesis, and I actually gave that a talk about it to Frank Drake and the crew up at the SETI Institute about 5 or 6 years ago, and it's on their website. And my thing was, if you look at the Drake equation, most people won't really understand it other than a very simplistic level. And that simplistic level will never involve what a real scientist will engage in, which is called error analysis. In that any number that my undergraduate hands me in a test must be accompanied by a corresponding estimate of their ignorance. Remember, science is the belief in the ignorance of experts, not the knowledge of experts, not the wisdom of experts. So when you look at a measurement or a prediction, like Fermi or like Drake, these are predicated on quantities which have inherent uncertainties within them. And in the case of the existence of one, that collapses the uncertainty in this Bayesian analysis, and it puts a very strong prior. Yes, we are alone. And where I thought you were going, John, is very interesting, maybe to pursue as a sidelight. What would happen the next day? And I like to point out that, you know what, John, actually alien life was discovered. It was discovered on Mars, and it's never been refuted. It was discovered in 1996 on a meteorite found in the Allen Land Hills in Antarctica, where I do some of my research. And this meteorite caused such a stir because it had the byproducts of microbial respiration that came not from the Earth, with very high likelihood, from Mars. And from Mars, it came with microbes. In other words, the public was led to believe, not only in scientific journals, but in a press conference held on the White House lawn by then President Bill Clinton. And you can see this very scene in a movie about past guest on our shows, Jill Tarter. And Jill Tarter is the lead character in Contact by Carl Sagan. And that, she's based on it. They actually diverge at some point, but she's Ellie Arroway's inspiration. Carl Sagan said that to me. Or not, he didn't say that to me, but co-author Andrewian told me that on my show. Now, this character, she in that movie, they're talking about life discovered, technological life, not microbial life. But they use that press clipping and that media interview and that press conference on the White House lawn. So now, John, that's never been retracted. They've never been refuted. This is now what, 24 years ago, 25 years ago? This is still, in many people's minds, evidence for the existence of extraterrestrial life, not intelligent life per se. I don't think these microbes are particularly intelligent, if it's indeed ever confirmed, which, I don't see very many prospects coming forward to confirm or refute it. So anyway, the question of what would happen the next day is a very interesting question. And the question of how it sociologically would be accepted, I think we already know the answer to that, the N of one problem.
There is there's a line though here, because there was a time where it was common knowledge during the days of Percival Lowell that there was a civilization on Mars that was building canals that were seen by Schiaparelli and all of those guys. And these optical illusions, is what they turned out to be, were taken as proof of life on Mars. Point is, talk around the dinner table, everybody believed at one time that there was life on Mars and that Venus probably had jungles and all of these old ideas that turned out to be drastically wrong. But we also had the labeled release experiment in the Viking missions where something metabolized, something happened on the surface of Mars, which seems unlikely in that environment to have microbial life. But then again, we also have bacteria here on Earth that can survive ridiculous amounts of radiation, doses that they really shouldn't. And I think it's 25,000 times, Deinococcus radiodurans can absorb that would kill a human. Although that may actually be a co-product of being able to dry out. They think that's it wasn't actually in space and didn't get that adaptation there, but got it here. That also happens to give it amazing radiation shielding or ability to survive, and recover from getting dosed. So in light of that, human civilization probably would not collapse if we found microbial life on Mars. And indeed, if you really take a look at the world's religions, people always say, well, the religions will never be able to handle it. The fact is they either don't address it or they already have handled it, and that it's in their books already that the possibility is open. So there really isn't anything that says that bad things will happen if you discover alien life. And in fact, most people, when you poll most people, at least in the United States, they already believe it does in one form or another somewhere out there. It could be anywhere. Because why would we be unique? I mean, come on. Earth would become like the island from Lost and would be this magical place where an organic chemistry process that doesn't happen anywhere else in the universe happens here and produces life. So that it gets at some point silly. So you have to assume there's other life out there. And I personally think that we live in a microbial universe and that they're everywhere. Maybe not intelligence, but that might be rare. But microbes, I'll bet they're all over the place.
Well, where I am now at UC San Diego was the former, final resting place, so to speak, scientifically, of Harold Urey, who, in addition to discovering the deuteron, the heavy partner of hydrogen rather, he and his student Stanley Miller conducted the most famous abiogenic experiment ever done, called the Miller-Urey experiment. And that experiment, very controlled fashion, synthesized with simple chemical reagents and thermal processes, electrical processes, dozens of amino acids and other precursors. Not a microbe didn't pop out, a little green man didn't pop out, but nevertheless there was this incredible discovery that some of the precursors could have been easily formed in the conditions of the early Earth. Now, these are very controversial, by the way. There are some that criticize these for being, kind of a directed evolution, that you have, very clean reagents, highly purified and in pristine condition from reagent companies like Aldrich and Fisker, and then you put them in your autoclave jars and stuff that wouldn't exist. Anyway, ignoring that and ignoring the fact that Earth's early atmosphere is radically different from that simulated by Professor Urey and Dr. Miller. Nevertheless, it's an interesting experiment. Now, I ask you though, if these molds are found, or slime molds or microbial life that you feel flourishes throughout the cosmos, if this was found, what would be the impact the next day? Again, we have examples of that. You don't even have to look at what we're doing, here in San Diego. I can walk a mile from my office and I can scoop up a glass of fresh Pacific Ocean water. There's trillions and trillions of life living organisms in there. And yet, what are we doing to them? What are we just doing to the oceans, to the atmosphere, to the planet? And I'm not like an alarmist by any means, but it's obvious that mankind has some impact on the planet. The planet will survive just fine without us. But nevertheless, we can dump, 1,000 gallons of oil come up every couple of weeks off the coast of Santa Barbara, and they shut down the beaches. So we know humans can affect life in the ocean. Do we care? No, but let's go deeper. The last century, by any human standard whatsoever, was the bloodiest century in humanity's history. Despite what my past guest Steven Pinker said, you have to be very selective when his Enlightenment Now came out, when you start the clock, to justify the implicit evolution towards a more flourishing humanity. No, in fact, it's incredibly bloody. There's chattel slavery, there's forced marriages, there's all sorts of stuff that are happening, not 50 years ago, not genocides happening 100 years ago, the Holocaust. No, John, we're talking about now, today, 2021, September. It's happening. And you think that we're going to treat, a microbe from space, that's going to somehow, we can't even get our act together on Earth. We are so callous towards, I don't care if you're religious or not. I actually don't know if you are or not. But the point is, life is a miracle by almost any definition. It may be common, it may be rare, but the way that we have treated not only the least evolved single-celled life forms in the Pacific Ocean or elsewhere, but the way that we treat our other human beings, sentient beings and animals, it's atrocious. So I don't think humanity will react any differently upon the discovery. I'm a very, very pessimistic person when it comes to, we're going to have this kumbaya moment and we're all going to realize we're part of this cosmic whole because we share the same molecules as this microbe floating in the atmosphere of Venus, as my past guest Sarah Seeger talked about. So no, I'm not that sanguine about how revolutionary it will be for the flourishing of humanity. I'm in fact quite the opposite.
To answer your question, I'm not a particularly religious person or anything like that, but I am a humanist in the sense that I think we should explore space. And if we find microbial life on Mars, we should put it in a petri dish and then Lysol the planet so that we can conquer it and look for oil. But which there's actually a paper out there that posits that if you had microbial life on Mars, you could have hydrocarbons and petroleum. That actually does exist.
100%. Yeah, I've often asked this question of Freeman Dyson, the late great Freeman Dyson, who's the first guest on my podcast. I said, we talk about life on Earth, and we talk about, you can't have Zoom, John, and we can't have YouTube without whales. because whales were kind of the midwife of fossil fuel. They weren't they were living. I mean, they provided the candlelight, the fuel, to make possible the eventual mining of coal and drilling for oil. So in other words, the whales were midwives between the energy sources of the pre-industrial age and then our modern technological age. So you can't have a semiconductor without petroleum, at least our evolution on Earth. So do we expect that these other planets had dinosaurs, and whales, and would they have the same evolution? I guess you can get abiotic formation of hydrocarbons, as this paper that you're mentioned. But anyway, I think it's kind of funny to think about what are all the hurdles that life has to get through, as Professor Jeff Goldblum said in Jurassic Park. Life finds a way, but how many hurdles does life have to jump over? And what is the probability of each hurdle of it jumping over? I think it's fascinating. And that's why I say, I don't care if people believe or not. I think it's, if you desist from thinking about it, I don't think you're utilizing the 3-pound supercomputer that we're all given by nature, by evolution, or if you will, by some higher power.
Now, that also brings up the possibility of other pathways to intelligence, so that we know where we come from. Yes. But could there be other ways to arrive at intelligence that don't need a whale? Or don't need, the factors that led to us. And it seems to me that there's probably a lot of those. What do you think?
Yeah, there could be. And in fact, one of the things that I'm, kind of concomitant with all the Galileo worship that I exhibit is I want to create artificial Galileo. An artificial Galileo. I am recording now with Carlo Rovelli and another Italian physicist friend, along with Frank Wilczek, Nobel Prize winner, Fabiola Giannati, and Sylvester James Gates. We are recording for the first time in history an audiobook of any of Galileo's books. And in fact, we're recording the dialogue on 2 chief world systems, in which he advocates for the Copernican system over the Aristotelian or Ptolemaic or peripatetic, as he called it. Now, I started to think, well, it'd be kind of a waste if I just use this to make millions of dollars that I'm sure I'm going to make from this audiobook that's 20 hours long, featuring 5 different characters set in 1600s, Venice. I'm sure I'm going to be a billionaire from that. But in addition to that, I want to give back, right? I thought, I have the source text. Now I can take Galileo's 1 million words, drop them into GPT-3, and then say, here's everything that we know, Galileo. Here's everything that we've learned since you wrote this book and your other 12 other books. And now I'm going to feed in quantum electrodynamics. And now I'm going to feed in quantum chromodynamics. And now I'm going to feed in what we know about aliens and other phenomena. I'm going to feed that all in. And I'm just curious what comes out of this synthetic physicist called Galileo. And so you're right. These alternative pathways, it may have evolved that silicon life came, before, in some sense, before, advanced humanoid form, and maybe became self-assembling. I don't have the hubris to say which came first, the computer or the human being.
There are trillions of dollars to be made from this idea, sir.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, I have Sidereus Nuncius just right over there.
Awesome.
So I also enjoy a little Galileo. Now here's the scary question, and this is where the dividing line is. So humanity generally doesn't care if alien microbial life is found, and if we found a space whale or something like that, just a Dyson sunflower or something like that that isn't intelligent, people are going to be okay with it because they expect it.
Yeah.
If it's in the atmosphere with us and it's more advanced than we are in the form of UAP, then we go into Orson Welles territory, where it is very, very easy to spook people. And that's where the dividing line is. So do you think we would be better off, as socially speaking, not investigating UAP?
It's very interesting. I did some videos earlier this year about the dialogue, which is when I they say necessity is the mother of invention. So I was making this video about Galileo's dialogue, and it required me to read the book for the first or second time maybe. And I was like, oh, I'm a podcaster of ill repute. Why don't I use the medium I'm most comfortable with and get the audiobook version of it? And I found out obviously it doesn't exist. And I thought that was a shame. Einstein called this book the greatest work of not just of scientific kind of knowledge, but of popular science writing in human history, even better than his. That's what he says in the foreword, read by Nobel laureate Frank Wilczek in my upcoming audiobook. So I couldn't find it. And then I started thinking, well, if I can't find it and I want it, maybe other people will want it. And then I started diving deeper into what's called the controversy of this particular book, which eventually led to his house imprisonment. And I started to think about, well, let me be a steel man for the Catholic Church. Now, I'm a nice Jewish boy, although I was an altar boy in the Catholic Church, as you know from my first book, Losing the Nobel Prize. I share that weird distinction with no other people on earth, as far as I know. But anyway, the Catholic Church suppressed Galileo's findings. And I started to look, why was that? He wasn't tortured, but he wasn't treated particularly great. He lived in a nice villa where I eventually held a big festival in his honor to commemorate the 100th anniversary of relativity in 2015. But when I thought about, well, what would be your obligations as the Catholic Church when now this person is now teaching to the masses in a vernacular that they understand, namely Italian, not Siderius Nuncius, that's Latin, as you know. So he was allowed to teach in Latin. He could not teach in Italian because that was the language of the. Now, what obligation did the Catholic Church, the most powerful entity in that time, in that part of the world, did they have an obligation? Maybe this would cause panic. Maybe this would cause a loss of faith. In other words, there were political, military, social implications of a scientific discovery. So too, John, you're right. Maybe if we do describe or discover phenomena, it would have some benefit to some parties somewhere to suppress that. However, you have to ask, with all the telescopes, including those behind you, operating 24/7 at some part on the Earth, including Antarctica, where we operate, the BICEP telescope, where we operated from, all the time, every moment of clear skies and even cloudy skies, because our radio telescopes see right through clouds. So, and our gravitational wave telescopes don't even know the clouds exist. So you're having to really contort a vast conspiracy, not only by scientists, which are, in some sense sworn to uphold some level of truth and honesty and be merchants of truth, but also you'd have to have some conspiracy to suppress it among the very people who would benefit the most. John, I have to tell you, as a professor, I already have tenure. But you know what's a really quick way to get tenure? Definitively prove alien civilization exists with technological capabilities far beyond Earth. I mean, you might not even need to work at the University of California at that point anymore. So to answer your my long-winded questions, kind of summarize it rather, it is inconceivable to me that it would be possible to suppress this information. That doesn't mean that suppression hasn't occurred, but there's so many interested parties that what is known as the conspiracy number, how many people have to keep the conspiracy secret, grows as the number of people to the second power. It's almost inconceivable that many millions and billions of connections would be able to synchronize such a conspiracy.
Now, you mentioned Judaism and your relationship with it. Now, I also grew up Catholic and was an altar boy, but I was a terrible one. I was the one that the priest didn't want to get. But I'm nothing now. I'm simply an agnostic. I have no idea in regards to religion. Now, do you practice Judaism? How does that work with your relationship with science? I mean, the two are not mutually exclusive, of course, but and neither is Catholicism and science. But right. Give me your viewpoint on that.
Yeah, better, than most people that the Vatican operates a huge observatory. They're not averse to science. They have pontifical academies. They have conventions and discoveries and so forth. But specifically, I love you, but I will push back. I want to know if you're really an agnostic. And I had this argument, again, I'm sorry to drop names. I do it on occasion. Freeman Dyson, the late, great Freeman Dyson, my first podcast guest on the Into the Impossible podcast. I asked him, what's your relationship like with God? You're rumored to be an agnostic. And he said, yes, I feel like it's not really detrimental. And it's probably, like Pascal's wager, you could believe and be wrong, and there's no eternal damnation. But if you don't believe and it does exist, then you will be proven wrong. Okay, then you'll suffer this eternal fate. And I said, come on, Freeman. Let's assume aliens exist and one comes to visit Earth and wants to see one of its greatest luminaries, a man unfairly overlooked for the Nobel Prize in 1965. And they say, Freeman, you call yourself an agnostic. What do you do as an agnostic? What are the practices? What are the behaviors of an agnostic? He says, well, I don't do much. I just kind of, I don't profess to be a theist. And the word agnostic means not knowable, not, we don't know yes or no. It means in principle, it's not knowable, which I think is actually accurate. And I think all scientists at some level can maintain that and be scientifically and having scientific integrity. But nevertheless, I said, Freeman, you don't go to the same church that Richard Dawkins doesn't go to. My atheist friends, my agnostic friends in Judaism, you don't go to the same synagogue that Lawrence Krauss doesn't go to or Sam Harris doesn't go to. In other words, there's no functional way an intelligent agent like an alien could distinguish you from Richard Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss from, Sam Harris or whatever. There's no distinguishing behavior. And I'm a behaviorist. So what does it mean for me? Well, in Judaism, the word in Hebrew, Israel, that doesn't mean submit to God. It means wrestle, fight with God. And that means constructing ways not only to further your confirmation belief if you're a theist, but also question it. And as you might remember from my first book, I devised a series of experiments to test and falsify the existence of God, ultimately not successful. But that doesn't mean that the process is not in concert with the mission of being a true, what I call myself, a devout agnostic. In other words, I go to temple, I learned Hebrew and Aramaic long after I knew the New Testament. I read the Old Testament and I practice, but every day I try to steel man and straw man reasons to believe and reasons not to believe. And I come out more and more convinced that practicing a religious life, even if you don't believe it, is of value to humanity. And I say that with confidence, having spoken at the ethical humanist societies around the world, including the oldest one, I believe, in Chicago, and the Sunday Assembly, which is I call it an atheist church here in San Diego and LA. These are wonderful organizations that see the benefit in some practice of religion, attempt to emulate it without a supernatural power.
Well, I understand what you're saying. Now, I use the word agnostic for lack of any other word. The reality is that I'm an I don't know-ist, in that I simply have absolutely no idea about the existence of something supernatural that exists outside of nature. I don't know. And I it's in the same category as the multiverse. I don't know. But at the same time, I mean, growing up in a Catholic family, Catholicism can give great comfort, and any religion can give great comfort to some people, like my mother, and people like that actually practice it. It can help them deal with death and things like that I can't deal with so well, So it's you're right, there's a benefit to it, but it also leads you back to your new book. It leads to things like imposter syndrome, where you begin to think that something has happened to you that shouldn't have, like posting a YouTube video and ending up with a talk show with 270,000 subscribers, things like that should not happen, but did. So you start to wonder, you're like, what was the chances of that? And then you get into imposter syndrome where you're like, well, you are an imposter. And my conclusion on imposter syndrome, which you go into deeply in the book, especially in regards to the Nobel Prize, I just concluded that I was an imposter, and then it went away. So what is your take on imposter syndrome, and how does that relate to winning the Nobel Prize for, arguably the greatest honor that a human, at least a scientist, can get on this earth?
I think it's even as a human, as you said first. And in fact, I think that there are a great many atheists who practice religion, and that religion is worshiping the Nobel Prize. I will call this out to you, and it's kind of like an earworm. When you're listening to a book or reading a book or a science book, a popular science book, I challenge, almost any author not to use the word Nobel Prize. I've seen almost no books that don't mention the Nobel Prize of any variety in science, including some of my best friends that have written books, and including me, obviously. I've written 2 books with the word Nobel Prize in it. Now, if it becomes a religion, then there starts to be sort of a hierarchy with maybe a priesthood and maybe holy days, as we have in the Nobel Prize, Annunciation and Confirmation. And we have apostates. We have people that don't believe in it, like myself. And you have people that are, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, except it's called the Nobel Swedish Royal Academy of Sciences. So you have all these trappings. Now, my question is anybody worthy of this deification of the founding father of the religion, Alfred Nobel, when the awards are given on his death day, not his birthday, his death day, December 10th every year? Now, who is worthy of that? And I was really not planning to write this book until I received, just heard my colleague, Barry Barish, my friend, in this interview that I did on my YouTube channel and on my podcast, Into the Impossible. I asked him, just kind of in an offhand way, did you ever as a kid suffer, because he had mentioned he had low confidence. I said, do you think some of your confidence was bruised by the fact that you might have suffered from the imposter syndrome back then? And he said, what do you mean back then? I was like, what? He said, what are you talking about? I still suffer the imposter syndrome now. What are you talking about? You won the Nobel Prize. You're credited with co-building the most complex machine ever made, the most advanced detector, the thing that we would tell other civilizations about to brag to them. LIGO, reverberations in space-time so minute they are less than a billionth of the diameter of an electron or a proton. And he said, no, I suffered it. Worst of all, when I received my Nobel Prize. And ever since then, I said, how? He was going to get his prize. And after you get the prize, you have to sign this ledger, this logbook that testifies, I received my golden medal and my share of the $1 million purse. And he's a curious guy in the best possible sense, like all good scientists are. And he started to look through the book. Who signed this book before me? Let me look through this. And he came, Feynman, and he saw, Marie Curie, and then he saw Albert Einstein. And he said, the hair went up in the back of my neck. I'm not in the same league as Einstein. I'm just some guy from California, Oklahoma originally, but eventually California. Was good at sports, and I ended up in this whole thing. I don't deserve it. I don't deserve to be in the same league as Albert Einstein. I said, Barry, Albert Einstein had the imposter syndrome too, because he believed Isaac Newton was not only the greatest scientist in history, but he contributed more to Western civilization than any other human being before or since. And I said, guess what? Isaac Newton had the imposter syndrome. He's like, what are you talking about? I said, Isaac Newton had the imposter syndrome, and he failed terribly to live up to his idol, Jesus Christ. And so this is something that can never be cured, but can be subdued. And it can be subdued in a way that takes you a little bit out of your comfort zone to show you, like all good things, like going to the gym or anything else, or raising a kid or being a kid, that nothing good comes without courage, comes without struggle, without resistance. And overcoming this is pointing out ways that you can build up your skill set in the soft skills that scientists need to have in order to become the experts in a particular field. And I think we can use that whether we're podcasters, car salesmen, or what have you. So these lessons of subduing it and using it to your benefit, of flipping it around to then cause you confidence, I think that's a very powerful message of this book.
Yes, it is. And it's interesting how you wrote it with putting things you've learned as a professor and a scientist over the years in relation to the interviews with your guests. And it was very insightful, I thought. But what particularly interested me also was the idea of the scientific method, and specifically deductive versus inductive reasoning. Can you give us an overview of that, and why did you go into that in the book?
I thought it was important that scientists are venerated, tremendously for their qualities of curiosity, of inventiveness, of perspicacity, of perseverance. And these are all actually, sometimes these are qualities that we associate with children. Children are curious, children are inquisitive, children are fascinating and fascinated, but they're also, manipulative, they're jealous, they're petty, they don't play well with others, they like their own. And I started to think about all these parallels between ordinary people, in this case, children and scientists, and what is the difference? And I thought, well, one way is that the scientific method, is imperfect as it is, there is no one definition of it, but there's general frameworks of what the scientific method includes. And again, it traces to my hero, Galileo, in the sense that you can approach it in this two-sided way. And I have this way of memorizing it, a mnemonic that the deductive way kind of goes down, D for deductive, starting with a theory, moving from a theory to some generalized hypothesis, which then might project, kind of propose an observation that could be made, which would then confirm the original theory. So that's the modality of descent down the deductive method of the scientific method. Then there are other methods. And by the way, those are methods, say, with Einstein having a theory of general relativity, predicting that light should be bent as it traveled around the sun, the vicinity of the sun. Starlight in distant stars would be bent. And of course, that was his hypothesis. It was observed and it was confirmed in 1919 by Eddington, as you surely know. Now, there's another modality of the scientific method, which begins almost serendipitously with a surprising observation, from which a pattern can be deduced, from which a tentative hypothesis and then a theory can be predicted. And in my case, it was, or in the case of my field, it's a good example is the CMB. The cosmic microwave background was observed serendipitously by Penzias and Wilson in 1965, and eventually led to an understanding of the formation of the lightest elements, and maybe a formation of the universe itself, although quite surprising to many. That's really no longer the right way to think about the CMB as the origin of time, or owing to the origin of time, or even that the matter produced during Big Bang nucleosynthesis is really the origin of time. So that's still an open question, a reason for folks to speculate on, and that circle can continue of observation all the way down up to a theory, or from theory down to a prediction of an observation. So I thought that was an interesting way to think about it. As you know, I think serendipitous discoveries are the most interesting because they're pure, they're free of confirmation bias, that perhaps the deductive pathway is a little bit more subjected to.
Now, with confirmation bias, that brings into the question of all bias, all biases, and eliminating them. Now, what is the process that you as a scientist, what do you do? What do you go through to examine your biases, identify them, and negate them?
So the most powerful tools that we have, as Richard Feynman says, the first principle is you shouldn't fool yourself. And the second principle is you're the easiest person to fool. And I add a third, you shouldn't fool Feynman. I think that's cruel to fool Feynman. So one of the things you can do is construct a balanced experiment, a null experiment. And the way that you could do that, in one case, say, I'm studying the cosmic microwave background and its polarization with a perhaps hope to detect waves of gravity definitively, not dust particles aligned in the Milky Way galaxy, as I talk about in Losing the Nobel Prize. And those might trace themselves to the origin of the universe via a process called inflation, which may hint at a multiverse. So from a very, very far removed set of events, you might deduce something that has huge impact on philosophy, theology, fundamental physics, forces, and fields. Now, to be careful about that, you can start to construct sub-experiments. You can construct an experiment that will test for the veracity of the signal, and you can do so in a variety of different ways, but all of them in some way or another involve producing a fake signal or a difference in your signals that should be zero. So in other words, if I make a map of the universe and all the galaxies in it, say, on a Monday, I should get the exact same map on Tuesday. Therefore, if I take the difference between those two maps, there's always some unavoidable amount of noise. And the difference between the map on Monday versus the map on Tuesday should be zero within the noise. And then you can test, well, what are the properties of your noise? Is it pure random white noise? Does it have some systemic biases? Does it have prejudices? And those are all the things you're trying to look for to guard against confirmation bias, are different forms of systematic errors. But it gets even more interesting because those systematic errors can often be really interesting physics lurking within those. And another example comes from the CMB discovery, where there was a scientist working on the exact same telescope, John, before Penzias and Wilson had homed the laboratories and in Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey, of all places, and that discovery was made on the same telescope. But what this guy Ohm neglected to do is to construct this calibration system to test for the whiteness of the noise and the behavior of the signal and the immunity to systematic effects. He just chalked it up as, well, there's just some fluctuations of 3 Kelvin in magnitude. He didn't dig deep into the systematic errors as Penzias and Wilson did. And of course, they had a not insignificant prize waiting for them at the end.
Not insignificant prize, meaning the Nobel Prize. Now, everybody should check out Brian's newest book, Into the Impossible, Think Like a Nobel Prize Winner, and also Losing the Nobel Prize, the previous book. And also everyone should check out the Into the Impossible podcast and Brian's channel here on YouTube, Brian Keating. Brian, it was a pleasure, and as always, and I hope you'll come back soon.
I will come back anytime you'll have me, and congratulations on all your success and your beautiful new studio, making me jealous as if you had won the Nobel Prize of podcasting.
Well, you should, yeah, Nobel Prize in podcasting. Now, I did win. I do have 2 silver YouTube buttons, and that's as close as I'll ever get to a Nobel Prize, because they don't give them to ne'er-do-wells like me.
Something to aspire to. Thank you, John.
Thanks for listening. I am futurist and science fiction author.
Wrong channel.
No, it's not. Thanks for listening. I am futurist and science fiction author John Michael Gautier, currently hosting Event Horizon and wondering where Anna actually came from. One day I had a tablet computer, the next I had a boss. Very disturbing. And be sure.
And that's enough of that.
YouTuber forever. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell.
Sell out.
What?